Hello everybody, you're listening to the Polymath Radio Show with your host, Daniel Aaron Levy. Today's episode is one of the different kinds of capitalism and which of them actually work. Now this is the third episode in a multi-episode special that I'm running about an objective guide to different political ideologies. But don't worry, you don't need to watch any other episodes to understand this one. I've designed this whole special so you can enjoy each episode individually and it will all make complete sense. At the same time, if you do want to check out the preceding episodes, what is capitalism, the introduction to this series, and what do the terms left-wing and right-wing actually mean, that would optimize the whole viewing experience. It would make a difference and it would give you the maximum enjoyment of this. But that's okay. You don't need to do that. You're busy. I get it. It's okay. Now, this episode, I actually recorded this yesterday and I'm doing it again because it wasn't up to the Polymath standard, ladies and gentlemen. And I just want this to be as good as possible, as high quality as possible, as structured and as concise as possible. What I want to do is combine my interest in this topic with some good quality research and then present that in a structured way from lots of different perspectives. And that's what I hope that I've done with this episode. Now, let's get into it. So, a brief thing that we should understand before exploring this episode is what actually is capitalism. Now, of course, this is explored in the previous episode, in episode 10, but you don't need to listen to that, and we're going to give a brief summary of it right now. Now, capitalism is an economic system wherein the means of production are owned privately and operated for profit in a market economy. What does that mean? The means of production is just how stuff gets made, and it basically consists of labor, the instruments of labor, and the subject of labor. The instruments of labor is stuff like tools, factories, buildings, infrastructure, restaurants, supermarkets, etc. The subjects of labor is stuff like land, natural resources, and raw materials. And the means of production is basically just labor acting on the subjects of labor, using the instruments of labor to create goods and services. Another definition of the means of production is the three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Capital in this case just meaning resources, just meaning stuff. It could be money, it could be bonds, stocks, assets, could be capital goods. And a capital good is a physical, tangible good that is needed to make more stuff. So for example, machinery is a classic example of a capital good. Now, owned privately and operated for profit. That means it's not owned by the state and it's not owned necessarily by the workers working there. It's owned by an individual or firm who happens to own or have access to the private property of the means of production, and it's operated for the purpose of generating profit. It's not operated for state goals. They're operated for the accumulation of capital, i.e. resources, on behalf of the individual or firm. And that takes place in a market economy. And a market economy is basically a mechanism in society of allocating resources. And basically means that what gets produced and how what gets produced gets distributed to people is based on economic rules like supply and demand. Now we're going to see that in the different forms of capitalism, we often kind of bend this definition where we have some means of production being owned by the state and some means of production being operated for state goals. But, and don't worry, we're going to get into that more later. But the point is, as long as the predominant economic form is means of production being owned privately and being operated for profit in a market economy, then it's capitalism. So that's going to become more relevant, that disclaimer, when we get into the more regulated forms of capitalism, such as those practiced by China. But don't worry, we'll get more into that later. Just the point here is that in capitalism, we have private ownership of the means of production in the form of private property. Private property is distinct from personal property. Private property is some kind of ownership over the means of production. For example, if you own a coal mine or land or a factory or the railways or ports, that's an example of private property, i.e. producer goods are counted under private property. Producer goods are just goods needed to make more goods. Consumer goods, i.e. end products that are enjoyed for their own sake, for example, watches, toothbrushes, electronics, fans, bedding, etc. Consumer goods are counted as personal property. Now in capitalism, the idea of private property is central to the idea of capitalism. Socialism, as an economic system, also has private property. Don't worry, we're going to be getting more into what socialism is next episode, but I'm just leaving that as an aside. It's only economic systems like communism and anarchism which don't recognize private property. Now, Now that we've kind of got a basic idea of what capitalism is, it's really important to emphasize that capitalism is an economic system. It's not an ideology per se. What do I mean by an ideology? Well, in episode 9, we get into this in a bit more detail, but basically an ideology is a set of beliefs, views, and practices that has 3 components. One of these components is political. The ideology, to be an ideology, has to say something about how political power should be distributed, how it should be used, what's the nature of power, what can authorities in the state do, what can they not do, etc., etc. The second component of an ideology is indeed economic. How should the economy work? And the third component of an ideology is socio-cultural. And when I say socio-cultural, I mean partly stances of that ideology on social issues like feminism/sexism, racism, LGBT, nationalism, abortion, etc., etc. But I mean in a deeper sense, what are the moral values behind that ideology? What does that ideology say is good? What does that ideology say is the purpose of a society? But here's the thing. Capitalism, of course, being an economic system, has quite a bit to say about the economic side, the economic aspect of ideology. Although even then, capitalism is a massive umbrella term that takes on lots of different forms. But capitalism is compatible with a huge range of political situations and a huge range of socio-cultural situations. So it's compatible with various different socio-political philosophies. Socio-political, just by when I say that, I just mean combining the political and socio-cultural aspects. For example, capitalism is fully compatible with fascism. And in fact, fascist economics are classically use a variety of capitalism. It's also compatible with social democracy. It's also compatible with classical liberalism. These are kind of just buzzwords at the moment that I'm throwing with you. We explore these at different points throughout the podcast. Throughout the special, but don't worry, we're going to be giving some more information about these words later. The point I'm just trying to make is that capitalism is compatible with all kinds of things, including liberal democracy, the current authoritarian dictatorship of the People's Republic of China, also fascism in Europe. So, there is this kind of common misconception that capitalism, especially in the context of the Cold War, capitalism means freedom. And that's because historically, capitalism, the economic system, has evolved with the socio-political system of liberalism. Now, liberalism is something that we address and talk about properly in episode 9. But just as a summary of liberalism, liberalism is a socio-political philosophy which basically says that the goal of society should be an association of free and equal individuals. And then in the philosophy of liberalism, freedom and equality are inherently good values. Now, there's lots of different varieties and interpretations of liberalism, which kind of define freedom and equality in different ways and want different extents of them. But the point is that freedom and equality, as buzzwords, are seen as good things. In a liberalist society, justice, humanity, when I say humanity, I mean the restraint of violence, truth and reason, are also seen as inherently good things. This is an important distinction because the vast majority of societies throughout human history have not seen violence as an inherently bad thing, and have indeed often seen violence as a good thing. It's only in the 1700s in Europe that we start to see a dominant philosophy emerging which says that violence is not a legitimate way that states should be kind of organized on. Now, liberalism is the dominant philosophy of the West at the moment. There's been lots of different varieties of it, including classical liberalism, which is the liberalism that prevailed from about the period of 1789 to 1914 in the Western world. That is a historical period known to historians as the long 19th century. 1789, the French Revolution, to 1914, the outbreak of World War I. And in classical liberalism, there's minimal government intervention in the economy, and the emphasis is on economic freedom. More on that in a moment, by the way. There's other varieties of liberalism which emphasize social justice and the provision of social security and social services and welfare, and some basic provision of economic equality. Social liberalism is kind of a broad ideology which emphasizes these things. And capitalism has historically been very strongly associated with different forms of liberalism. Because in Western societies today, for example, are all capitalistic and all liberalistic, and also capitalism kind of evolved and developed with this philosophy of liberalism. But remember, they're not the same thing. It is entirely possible for capitalism to be compatible with something like fascism, which is not liberalist at all, in that fascism doesn't see freedom and equality as inherently good things, And fascism also doesn't see violence as inherently bad. But again, more on fascism later. Now, another question to ask is capitalism left or right wing? And that brings us to the question, what actually is left or right wing? Now, we address this in episode 8 of Polymath. Specifically, what do the terms left wing and right wing actually mean? But basically, the left-right wing spectrum is this one-dimensional political spectrum that actually we can diffract into having 3 components. So imagine we're splitting up that one-dimensional axis into 3 different axes, each of which is based on a different matter, and they all kind of combine to produce that 1D spectrum. One of these 3 axes is the libertarian/authoritarian axis. It's basically saying how much political power should the government have over the lives of the people living in that country. Basically, what is the nature of political power what is the nature of political power in whatever situation is being assessed? Who holds it? How can it be used? How many limits are there on it? Now again, just as with the whole political aspect of ideology, capitalism doesn't really say much about this. It's possible for a very libertarian society to be capitalist, although the most libertarian societies, as seen in communism and anarchism, are explicitly not capitalist. By the way, when I say communism and anarchism, I mean the political science definition of communism and anarchism, not what various countries in the 20th century did in the name of communism, but more on that in future episodes. Don't worry, we're going to get into that. Now, in terms of that, our second axis that we can diffract the left-right spectrum into is economic leftism versus economic rightism. And that basically means how much does the government get involved in the economy? At the far end of economic leftism is the idea of central planning, where the government says exactly what gets made, how that stuff gets made, and where that stuff goes. At the far end of the economic left-right spectrum is totally unregulated capitalism. Indeed, it's an economic ideology called minarchism, where the government provides an army, a police force, and the law courts, and that's it. Now, capitalism on the economic left-right axis can vary, again, really, really massively, because it's an umbrella term, but the limits are a little bit more, actually quite considerably, let's just say they're more narrow than they are in the whole libertarian authoritarian axis. Because while something like central planning isn't compatible with capitalism can extend from the far right of the economic left-right spectrum to quite solidly left on the economic left-right spectrum. A final axis that we can split the left-right spectrum into is the progressive conservative axis. Basically, what are the stances held on social views like feminism, abortion, racism, LGBT, but also in a broader sense, just as I said with ideology, what ethical judgments, what ethical values are held to be good, what values are held to be bad. Now again, capitalism is compatible with basically anywhere on this spectrum, apart from the far progressive end, which is held by the political science definitions of communism and anarchism. Basically, capitalism varies massively on the libertarian authoritarian axis and on the progressive conservative axis, although within certain limits as prescribed by philosophies like communism and anarchism, and to a lesser extent socialism. On the economic left-right axis is basically where the different forms of capitalism tend to vary. And it's what we're going to be exploring in this episode. Because as I said again, the different forms of capitalism, all the different models and the different varieties are broadly compatible with any different kind of socio-political philosophy. What's differing is the role of the government in the economy. I hope that makes sense. Basically what I'm trying to say is that in those 3 different axes that we can diffract the left-right spectrum into, the economic leftism versus economic rightism axis is what's relevant to this discussion. By the way, don't get confused. Economic leftism and economic rightism are not the same as leftism and rightism as a whole. Economic leftism and economic rightism specifically refers to the extent of government intervention in the economy. Now, on this economic left-right axis, capitalism occupies everywhere from the far right to solid left. It doesn't occupy, once you get further to the left, you get philosophies like socialism, communism, and anarchism, which by definition are opposed to the economic system of capitalism, so capitalism can't be too far left. The boundaries of capitalism on our economic left-right axis are defined by opposed philosophies like socialism, communism, and anarchism. But Within the majority of this spectrum, including at the furthest right of that spectrum, capitalism can be present. Now, at the farthest economic right of that spectrum, we have minarchism, which I mentioned. The government only provides a state, army, and a justice system. And we're going to be going through that economic spectrum from the far economic right, further and further to the economic left, just covering the different models and different varieties of capitalism. Now, the next most economic right-wing form of capitalism is laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire capitalism is also known as free market capitalism, it's also known as raw capitalism, and it's also known as hyper-capitalism. The idea is that there is no external government influence on markets at all. There's no regulations, there's no minimum wage, there's no pensions, there's no unemployment benefits, there's no government influence on markets. The market just acts and does whatever it does. The invisible hand of the market is completely unrestricted. The government, unlike minarchism, can provide public goods like parks and libraries, but that's it. It can provide these kinds of public goods, but it can't get involved in the economy itself. The idea behind laissez-faire capitalism is that you have maximum economic freedom. And with the onset of economic freedom, you ultimately get a free society. The idea being that workers in a free society are politically free to dispose of their own labor. They can quit a job that they don't like, and they can accept another job that they do like. And the idea is that they can be happy in that way. Now, laissez-faire capitalism grew up in around the 1600s and 1700s at a time where the economy was heavily restricted by the government, but it wasn't restricted by the government for the good of the national economy or for the good of the workers. It was restricted by the government so as to just bring short-term profit to the royal treasury. More on that again in episode 9, but we're just breezing past that right now because it's not super relevant to this discussion. It's just a bit of background. Now, in practice, as I think most people listening to this podcast would be able to deduce, and indeed economists by now practically universally agree on, is that this complete unregulation of capitalism does not in fact lead to economic freedom. In fact, contemporaries at the time, for example, actually, I'm going to get onto that in a moment. You'll see why in a bit. But again, in practice, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't lead to maximum economic freedom, and also laissez-faire capitalism in itself needs regulation to be maintained. So we see this in the late half of the 1800s, where basically a very little restriction of the unfoldings of capitalism in the USA leads to the snowballing of certain companies and corporations getting larger and larger and larger and swallowing up all their competitors to the point where you get either monopolies, which is when one company has a kind of is the only company that can dispense a good or a service, or you get oligopolies, which is basically like a monopoly, but with a few companies rather than one company. And in fact, the USA, even in an era when it was broadly committed to laissez-faire capitalism in the early 1900s, enacted a bunch of laws called antitrust laws, a trust in economics is a monopoly, in order to restore competition to the economy. Because if you have monopolies and oligopolies, there's no real economic competition because that whoever owns that monopoly or whoever are the cooperating companies in oligopoly can basically do whatever they like. In fact, most economies now, in fact, pretty much all economies now have a field of law known as competition law, which is specifically designed for intervening in the economy in order to maintain competitiveness. This is important because the point is that laissez-faire capitalism basically contains the seeds of its own destruction. Capitalism, if left unregulated, does not lead to great economic freedom. It leads to a loss of competitiveness, and that limits economic freedom. Now, here's the thing. No countries ever have actually technically been laissez-faire, because laissez-faire is the absence of any government restriction on the economy. It's the absence of any government influence on any kind of market. In practice, no state has actually done this. But some countries in different periods have come quite close. An example is the UK in the late 1700s and early 1800s, where there were regulations of the economy, but the ideal, i.e. what economists were aiming for at the time and what they saw was good, was a laissez-faire economy. Now, technically, no society has ever been a free market capitalist society, because as long as there's any kind of minimal regulation and intervention, it's not called a free market, it's called a regulated market, also known as a coordinated market. But in practice, even though the UK and the USA at various points weren't technically free market economies or laissez-faire economies, they came very close to that ideal. And indeed in the UK, I'm just using the UK as an example, in the early 1800s, the idea was a laissez-faire economy. People at the time were aiming for a laissez-faire economy. It was believed at the time that a laissez-faire economy was good and led to the greatest prosperity and happiness. What was preventing that were the agitations of the working classes who, for example, wanted minimum wages or a reduction of a 14-hour workday, or who would like some compensation after getting their hand torn off an industrial machine. But the idea is that people were aiming for a laissez-faire society. And laissez-faire economics are based on a socio-political philosophy of classical liberalism. And classical liberalism promotes political and economic freedom at all costs. Even, they say that equality and political and economic equality aren't bad things, but the idea is that freedom is emphasized over equality. And in classical liberalism, private property is the central concept, although that's common to all forms of liberalism. Also in classical liberalism, everyone is technically politically equal and legally free. They can organize of their own labor, they can quit their jobs if they want to, they can ascend the social scale, but they're not getting any help to do that. The idea is that the government intervening in the economy and providing social services undermines freedom. And the idea is that political equality and political freedom is a sufficient degree of freedom in society. Classical liberals don't say that some degree of welfare needs to be provided in order for people to be actually free in a society. Classical liberalism, by the way, is a historical form of liberalism. It doesn't really exist today, although it does exist in a revamped version. More on that later. Now, the idea of an laissez-faire aiming economy, a classic example is the UK in the early 1800s, which had very, very, very little legislation protecting the workers. Another example is Gilded Age America. Gilded Age America Gilded Age America refers to a period of US history in approximately the late 1800s. This form of capitalism, i.e. this very under-regulated capitalism, is quite well known, both to contemporaries at the time and historians now, as leading to some quite shocking examples of injustice. For example, contemporaries in the early 1800s, whenever they were visiting Manchester, which was an early industrial centre, basically unanimously remarked at how horrific it was. They unanimously lamented the condition of these masses of poor employees struggling by check to check, or wage hour to wage hour, I should say, in terrible, cramped, unsanitary, smoky, cloudy conditions where smog partially blocked out the light of the sun, living in bad conditions, making just enough to survive, losing limbs in industrial accidents, and where basically there was a massive, because there's an imbalance of power between the employee and the employer anyway, where the employer needs the employee much less than the employee needs work, coupled with a lack of any social regulation, and you had a situation which was appalling even to people in the early 1800s. This was an era, by the way, where torture was still legal in some form or another in many European countries. Now, in Gilded Age America, another classic example of abuse is when companies would pay workers not in actual money, but in tokens that could only be redeemed at a company store set up by the employer to sell basic living goods at massive prices, therefore forcing the workers in that company to go into more and more debt to keep staying alive, and therefore never being able to leave the employ of the company. As you can see, the idea of laissez-faire capitalism, or the ideal of laissez-faire capitalism, hasn't led to very positive results for most people in society. Another quite important thing to note is that no country to date has ever become more developed or industrialized by a laissez-faire policy, or at least a policy which explicitly aims to be laissez-faire. The one exception to this is the UK, because it was the first country to industrialize. A little bit more on that later. Now, a more modern form, a kind of modern revamp of classical liberalism, but a little bit more economically leftist, i.e. accepting more government intervention in the economy, is that of neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism is a socio-political philosophy that emerged in the 1970s after the great post-war economic boom after World War II ended, and there was a situation in Western countries of stagflation. That is, both lack of growth, unemployment, and inflation. Now, neoliberalism was backed by a school of economists called the Chicago School of economics, which basically said that deregulation and privatization and intervening in the economy as little as possible was a good thing and that would lead to prosperity. This is relevant because during that post-war economic boom, so in about the mid-1900s, there was much more regulation of the economy. But again, more on that later. We're just moving in this episode from more economically right-wing forms of capitalism to more economically left-wing forms of capitalism. Now, neoliberalism as a socio-political philosophy was made dominant in the Western world, and by extension the world at large, by the figures of Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the USA, with Ronald Reagan's neoliberal form of economics being known as Reaganomics. The idea of trickle-down economics also comes from Reaganomics. Reagan quite famously said, this may be a bit of a paraphrasal, but Reagan famously said that big government is not the solution, big government is the problem. The idea being that government needs to play a very small role in the economy. And it's a bit more economically left-wing than the classical liberalism, laissez-faire ideal form of the economy that occurred in the UK in the early 1800s and in the USA in the Gilded Age, but not by much. In neoliberalism, the defining features of the economic so neoliberalism is kind of combines so neoliberalism, you could argue, is an ideology because neoliberalism is its own economic system, but it's also the socio-political philosophy of liberalism. Neoliberalism is a different interpretation of the socio-political philosophy of liberalism. So neoliberalism, in that respect, you could call it an ideology, although I think most people would really just call it a system of economics, because when you say the word neoliberalism, people like the colloquial meaning isn't really liberalism in terms of the social and political philosophy. It's more just a way of running the economy. So neoliberalism, some of the tenets of neoliberalism are privatizations of public industries, for example, railways, water infrastructure, utilities, etc., etc., etc. Privatization of any kind of state-owned enterprises or nationally owned enterprises, that kind of thing. Deregulation of corporations, a decrease of government spending and public work spending and spending on social security and social services. So decrease in spending on things like infrastructure, education, healthcare, welfare, things like that. Lowering of taxes and as I said, fewer social services being provided. Neoliberalism is not the same as laissez-faire because it supports some mild degree of intervention, or at least more intervention than was seen in the classical liberal economies of the 1800s in the Anglo-Saxon world. Anglo-Saxon world, by the way, refers to the UK and the USA. It also advocates quite a strong state to enforce these regulations. Strong state, not as an authoritarian state, but just the idea that there has to be a state which has the power to levy some regulations in the economy. That's what I mean by the phrase a strong state. Indeed, neoliberalism is very consciously a libertarian philosophy. It argues for as small a role of the government as possible and as little government intervention in the economy as possible. The idea, just as in classical liberalism, is that the hand of the market will translate the selfishness of each individual economic actor into overall national gain and national prosperity. Now, the word neoliberalism is often actually used as a pejorative now, and it's been blamed for a lot of the social ills of the present time, which is partly valid. So neoliberalism was inaugurated in the 1970s when the global economic boom ended, and since the onset of neoliberalism, so since the 1970s, there have been quite a few quite bad economic effects. The main ones have been a massive rise in inequality and also a stagnation in real wages for the majority of society. Real wages are just wages as measured by inflation. While there has been some rise in real wages, particularly for the lower socioeconomic classes of society, real wages in different Western countries have either stagnated or have actually fallen. At the same time, the real wages of the top 1% have skyrocketed since that period. In the USA, for example, the top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 80% of society. There's a huge plethora of research right now that inequality leads massively to social malaise, social agitation, different variations of acceptances of extremism, and generally turns towards more extremist political views. The rise of the alt-right and far-right parties can, to a quite significant extent, be contributed to this phenomenon. But it's worth noting that the economic malaise which has been present in the Western world for the past few decades can't just be attributed to neoliberal policy, but also global changes in general. For example, the rate of productivity growth each year has halved since the 70s compared to the preceding couple of decades, but we don't necessarily know that's because of neoliberal policies. There's also some case to be made of neoliberal policies working in countries. For example, Chile experienced an economic miracle after it was advised by economists from the Chicago School, such as Milton Friedman. But then there's also a case that much of the economic growth of Chile can be attributed to periods where it actually regulated the economy more and kind of diverged from neoliberal orthodoxy a bit. So it's complex, but as a general rule, the consensus among economists is that neoliberalism doesn't work and that it definitely generates social ills. The word austerity, which has again become a kind of negative buzzword in modern politics, is a classic feature of neoliberalism because austerity is a reduction in social spending, by definition, which is a classic policy of neoliberalism. The idea is that you cannot... Okay, more on this later, but the idea of neoliberalism is that if the economy is in a bad shape and there's a recession, what has to be done is to cut all forms of social spending in order to restore the economy, which, self-obvious as that may sound, wasn't actually economic orthodoxy from the period of around 1933 to 1973. But again, we'll get more on that later. The idea is that austerity is part and parcel of what neoliberalism is, and that has obviously had very negative social effects for a lot of people. So, neoliberalism is associated with a model of capitalism called the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism. And the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism is associated with the UK and the USA and basically argues for minimal government intervention. So it's associated with neoliberalism, and previously in the 1800s, it was associated with classical liberalism. Now, in practice, the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism was inaugurated by Thatcher and Reagan and can be seen as a kind of Thatcherite slash Reaganomic model of economics. But it's not really neoliberal because actually, especially in the UK, there's quite a bit of social regulation and there's classically state-provided healthcare in the form of the NHS. So the UK, for example, wouldn't be classified as a neoliberal economy. It would be classified as a social market economy. The USA would probably fit this definition as well, although the USA is still less economically regulated than the UK. There is still some degree of state provision of healthcare in the USA. In fact, the USA spends a bigger proportion of its budget, I think 13% of its GDP, on healthcare. It spends a greater proportion of its GDP on healthcare than any other Western country. It's just that healthcare coverage is very inefficient because pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies have so much power in the USA. And it's also that healthcare coverage doesn't actually cover everyone state-provided healthcare only covers certain groups in the USA. Now, this brings us to the term social market economy. I mentioned the UK was a social market economy. What is a social market economy? It's got lots of different names. A regulated market economy is one. A form of social capitalism is one. It's also known as Rhine capital, and it's also known as the Rhenish model. So as opposed to the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism, you have something called the Rhine model of capitalism. Now, that may be a bit confusing because I've just said that the UK is technically a social market economy, but there's this thing called the Anglo-Saxon model. The key thing to remember is that all of these terms are umbrella terms. The idea of social capitalism is an umbrella term. The Anglo-Saxon model is a model, but in practice has lots of different variations, and there is some overlap between the Anglo-Saxon model as practiced by the UK and the Rhenish model as practiced by various countries in continental Europe. That's what I'm trying to say. So that may seem like a bit of a paradox. How can the UK be a social market economy and therefore be kind of following the Rhenish model if there's a model named after it? It's because even though the UK may be explicitly based after the Anglo-Saxon model, it has enough regulation in the economy that it could technically be classed as an economically right-wing form of the Rhenish model, even if you wouldn't really use this term in practice. Now, the Rhenish model is named that because it's common in countries along the Rhine River in Europe. For example, France, Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Basically, the social market economy, or social capitalism, is when you still have capitalism. It's still a capitalistic economy, private property is still central, means of production is still overwhelmingly privately owned, but there's some regulation. There's some welfare provision, for example. There's some government intervention in the economy, and usually a greater extent of welfare provision. No, in fact, by definition, a greater extent of welfare provision and government intervention than is seen in the Anglo-Saxon model of capitalism. Now, Social capitalism is associated with the socio-political philosophy of social liberalism. We're noticing the word social a lot here. This is not socialism. These are very different things. Very different things, despite the slightly inconvenient similarity of the name. Social liberalism, social capitalism, and social democracy are still very much forms of capitalism. They're not socialism. More on socialism next episode. The idea of social liberalism is, and again, I explore this more in episode 9, but basically, social liberalism emphasizes that the government should provide some social justice and some social services. There should be some regulation and protection to address social issues like poverty, unemployment, I said poverty already, welfare, healthcare, education. The idea is that some government intervention is needed to increase people's actually existing economic freedom, because otherwise, without any regulations, they're not really free, because people live in quite poor conditions and are forced to accept quite poor jobs and working conditions. Another key idea of social liberalism is that economic freedom is important, but economic equality is also important as well. And the government should do something in the provision of economic equality. But again, this is not socialism. Now, the idea of social liberalism, the philosophy of social liberalism became dominant in the West after around 1933 or so, i.e. after the consequences of the Great Depression, which happened in 1929. It's also associated with the economic ideas of Keynesianism. The economic school of thought of Keynesianism is named after this guy called John Maynard Keynes, and he was one of the most influential economists of all time, to the point where I'm going to do a future episode about John Maynard Keynes. But John Maynard Keynes, a very basic gloss over of Keynesianism, is basically the economy doesn't just have a supply aspect of it, it also has a demand aspect of it. I.e., it's not enough to have goods and services in the economy, there need to be people who want to buy them. And lots of recessions and depressions in history have occurred due to a collapse of demand, i.e. people not spending money in the economy. John Maynard Keynes argued that the economy, just as blood needs to circulate around an organism to keep it alive, money needs to circulate around an economy to keep it alive. Because if no one is buying anything, then no one is making any money, which means that the standard of living plummets. This is exactly what happened in the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, there wasn't this massive economic crash because the USA suddenly lost all of its oil or coal or factories or railways. There was a massive economic crash purely because people just stopped buying stuff, and that collapse in demand shattered the economy. So the idea of Keynesianism is that the government should play an active role in generating demand in the economy, i.e. by employing lots of people to create public works, for example, or using financial policies to ease the natural fluctuations of the business cycle and to reduce unemployment. So the idea behind Keynesianism and social liberalism and social democracy is basically just democracy based on the philosophy of social liberalism. The idea is that it's been conceptualized as a kind of middle way between laissez-faire and socialism, where there's no attempt, unlike more economically leftist forms of economics, to plan production or to guide production. Policies are just kind of used to serve the welfare of the population and the needs of the population. But private property is still central and capitalism is still dominant. This is very much a form of capitalism. This kind of philosophy is known as the Rhine model because it's popular in the Rhenish countries now, but it was also popular in the entirety of the Western world, including the UK and the USA, during the period from the aftermath of World War II to around the early 1970s. Now, this era in economic history is known as the Golden Age of Capitalism, and it was basically the most economically prosperous period in human history. It was this massive economic boom, this post-World War economic boom, also known as the post-World War economic miracle. This huge boost in the economy, which occurred in around these few decades. And during these few decades, you had social liberalist policies, and essentially the form of capitalism was social capitalism. Now, this implies that the cause of the Golden Age of Capitalism was social capitalism and this kind of middle way, and what we'd now call the Rhenish model. And that's true to an extent. Let's just take a moment to talk about the causes of the Golden Age of Capitalism. Keynesian economics will say that it was Keynesian policies, and in fact, everyone at the time thought that this was the case. I mean, there's a famous kind of quote, I forget from who, but there's this famous quote from an eminent economist at the time, who basically said, "We are all Keynesians now," i.e. the idea of Keynes had found favor, had become accepted as orthodox economics, and the economic prosperity was attributed to Keynesian policies. Another potential cause of the Golden Age is actually something called the military Keynesian, which is basically when the government provides demand in the economy by basically asking for contracts for munitions, armaments, military technology, raw materials, etc., for military purposes. Now, the military-industrial complex is actually based on this idea, military Keynesianism. Not consciously. It's not as if the people creating the military-industrial complex were necessarily thinking this will inject demand in the economy. But the military-industrial complex, in what effects that it's had on stimulating the economy have been argued, have generally been done so in the name of military Keynesianism. Now, the military-industrial complex in the USA is basically when the government provides contracts to manufacturers for military contracts, so such as weapons, armaments, etc., etc. In fact, the idea as war being a very key economic stimulus isn't actually so crazy. Obviously, war can cause a huge amount of destruction to an economy, and that's exactly what you'd expect in the case of war. But if you have a war where there's little actual damage to a country, but you have the government creating plenty of demand for an economy, it can actually massively increase a country's economic prosperity. An example is how Italy benefited economically from the Korean War, and Italy had an economic miracle in around the post-war era, so around the Golden Age of Capitalism, and that was due both to the Marshall Plan, and then immediately following the end of Marshall Plan aid, the Korean War providing a massive demand stimulus and a massive kind of stimulus for production in the economy, but also the World War, so World War I and World War II, was a massive stimulus for the USA and helped it become the world superpower. The Napoleonic Wars also served as an economic stimulus for the UK at the time. And in fact, after the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, the UK had a post-war economic slump caused by the collapse in demand, because the government was no longer buying up raw materials and buying up machines and munitions, and therefore no longer providing demand for various factories and manufacturers. Some other cause of this Golden Age were new agricultural techniques gaining widespread popularity and therefore massively increasing agricultural productivity. Other causes include widespread infrastructure spending, and then of course low oil prices was a very important factor. So in the 1940s, oil cost $17 a barrel. It's now multiple times higher. An often cited cause of this Golden Age of Capitalism, this massive post-war economic boom, is actually wealth distribution via taxation. In this era, there was this marked turn towards redistributive taxation, so higher tax rates for the rich, so as to be pumped back into social services benefiting the poor. And this is often cited as a cause for the resulting economic prosperity, because the idea is that if everyone in society has enough money to spend on amenities, that provides a huge amount of demand. I'm just going to give an example. The famous car manufacturer Henry Ford, who actually worked before the Golden Age of Capitalism, basically famously paid his workers a very, very high wage, and when asked about it, basically said, well, it's good that I pay my workers a high wage because that means that they can buy my cars. The idea being that redistributive taxation, enriching the masses of the population, was a huge stimulus to the economy because those masses were then able to buy consumer goods and different forms of luxury goods that provided demand for manufacturers to make them, therefore keeping the economy healthy and afloat. Now, in this era, in the Golden Age of Capitalism, all social classes became noticeably wealthier. Since the 70s, partly due to economic policy in the form of neoliberalism, the lower classes of society have gotten only marginally wealthier, or not at all. Another factor in the Golden Age of Capitalism is that the government made a conscious commitment to maximum employment in society. Now, international cooperation was also a really important factor behind the Golden Age of Capitalism. The Marshall Plan especially. The Marshall Plan was in the USA, basically gave a ton of money, basically, not quite, but basically unconditionally, to a bunch of European countries, so as to discourage communism taking hold in these countries after World War II, and so as to also provide foreign markets for US exports, which would therefore boost the US economy. This worked very, very well for them. Another form of international cooperation which contributed to the Golden Age of capitalism was the European Economic Community, so a free market, basically reducing trade barriers between European countries. The European Economic Community developed into the EU, by the way. Now, social capitalism, just returning to social capitalism in general, is this massive umbrella term of different states of regulation of society. So, as I said, that Rhenish model, or the social capitalism Rhenish model, or the social capitalism model of capitalism, can be realistically contrasted with the Anglo-Saxon model, despite the UK now being a social market economy. It's at this stage that I want to introduce you guys the concept of a mixed economy. Now, a mixed economy has various different definitions. One definition of a mixed economy is when the government nationalizes some industries, for example, railways, the nuclear industry, defense, utilities, mail, water infrastructure, etc., 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 and some industries are left in private hands. This is still a form of capitalism, because in general, in countries which are mixed economies, the means of production are still generally privately owned and operated for profit. Now, a mixed economy, another definition of a mixed economy, is just an economy which combines free markets, so completely unregulated markets, with some degree of intervention. By this definition, every single society in history has been a mixed economy. Another definition of mixed economy is when there's both some nationalization of industries and intervention in the economy. In practice, any society which is going to have nationalized industries is also going to have economic regulation. Now, despite one of the technical definitions of a mixed economy just being some degree of intervention, in practice, the term mixed economy is used to denote either a significant enough degree of regulation such that an economy could realistically be called a form of social capitalism, or an economy in which some industries have been nationalized. Now, by this definition of mixed economy, throughout this Golden Age of Capitalism period, from the aftermath of World War II to the early 1970s, all of the Western countries, or all developed countries rather, were mixed economies by this definition. But even under neoliberalism, in the UK, for example, the UK is still a mixed economy. There are still, for example, healthcare is nationally owned, and there's quite a significant degree of regulation. So, there's also some middle ground between these models of the neoliberal model and the social capitalism model. An example of this middle ground between them is the USA in the 1800s, for example. So the USA in the 1800s, I'm talking about the kind of mid-1800s, so around the 1840s, 50s, 30s, that kind of period, when the USA was starting to industrialize. The USA had very little domestic regulation, but it had quite a lot of regulation of foreign trade. This is to say that the USA, in the mid-1800s, pursued a policy of protectionism, and that basically means raising tariffs for certain outside goods in order to increase the price of those goods to US consumers. This, by the way, some form of protectionism has been essential for all countries industrializing, with the exception of the UK, because they industrialized first. The reason for that is that in order for a manufacturer in your country, let's say the USA, to have their products bought, so in order to allow that manufacturer to stay in business, consumers in the USA have to buy their products. They cannot just buy manufactured products from foreign countries like the UK. But if the UK is already industrialized, their manufactured goods are going to be significantly cheaper than American manufactured goods. So if people keep buying the UK manufactured goods, then US manufacturers never get off the ground, and therefore the US never develops a manufacturing sector and it never industrializes. So the solution is protectionism, which basically makes it so the American consumer is better off buying from an American manufacturer than a British manufacturer. These policies were essential in allowing the USA to industrialize, and indeed all subsequent industrializing countries. More on that in a bit. I mean, for example, Germany. I'm going to use another example of Germany. Germany became a country in 1871. It rapidly industrialized and became incredibly prosperous, basically exceeding the UK in economic prosperity by the early 1900s, before World War I. What was the essential economic policies which allowed Germany to do that were protectionism and also a form of social capitalism. But Germany, Imperial Germany, the German Empire being the the German Empire being the state that existed between 1871 and in 1918, I think, when the Weimar Republic was proclaimed, the German Empire did not introduce a welfare state out of love for the working classes. Otto von Bismarck, who pioneered the welfare state in Germany, did so because he realized that it was needed to keep the country stable and to avoid socialist agitation and revolution. So, anyway, we talked about the Rhine model of capitalism. Slightly further to the left is the Nordic model of capitalism. Now, the Nordic model of capitalism is another form of mixed economy. It's still a form of capitalism. There's still a preponderance of private ownerships of the means of production, but there's also a very large percentage of employment in the public sector, around 30%. There's also a nationalization of many industries in Nordic countries. Nordic countries, by the way, includes Denmark, Scandinavia, I keep getting that mistake, man. Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and Finland. So examples of the industries that have been nationalized in the Nordic countries include utilities, mail, rail transport, airlines, electrical power, fossil fuels, chemical industry, steel mills, the electronics industry, machine industries, aerospace manufacturing, shipbuilding, and the arms industry. But this is still capitalism. The economy is still designed to allow maximum competition. The aim behind all these regulations, in fact, is to ensure economic competition by preventing the snowballing of certain enterprises and the formation of things like monopolies and oligopolies. The government plays a regulatory role in the economy. They oversee stuff, but they don't play a directive role in the economy. They don't say what gets done. They just kind of regulate the already existing forces of the market. The Nordic model of capitalism also incorporates a form of corporatism. Now, corporatism is not the same thing as a corporatocracy. A corporatocracy is a form of government where corporations rule the state. The USA is sometimes pejoratively called a corporatocracy, although it isn't a corporatocracy. Corporatism is just a system of social and economic organization where, I'm just going to get a definition real quick. So corporatism, just looked at the definition real quick, because I just wanted to make sure I had the technical definition right, although I did, so we're all Gucci. And it's basically where social groups such as labor unions and employers come together and discuss kind of various economic policies, for example, minimum wages, with the state mediating between them. This was also a classic element of fascist economics, although more on that later. The point being that something like corporatism can either be used for a left-wing, progressive, socio-political system like the Nordic model of democracy, and it can also be used by a hyper-right-wing socio-political system such as fascism. Now, Nordic countries at the moment represent the best states to live in currently in this era of human history, and therefore, by extension, because humanity is more prosperous and developed than it ever has been, the Nordic countries currently represent the best countries to live in human history. They're the happiest countries, they're the most developed countries, they have some of the lowest rates of social discord, they're routinely rated the most livable cities. The Nordic countries, basically, many people have studied the Nordic model of economics because they see it as one of the contributors towards the great success of these nations. Now, let's move slightly to the economic left. I'm conscious we're already at like 52 minutes, but we've got a lot more to say, man. I don't want to break this up again. No, you know what? I think this might just have to be a long episode. Because I know that these are technically meant to be an hour, but I don't want to split this up again. Like, this is already a split up of the what actually is capitalism episode. So you know what? I'm just going to keep going. Slightly to the economic left of the Nordic model is a form of state capitalism. Now, there's many different definitions of state capitalism, and it is, again, a vast umbrella term. But basically, the state not only owns industries, which is a key part of state capitalism, but it itself acts in the economy. It becomes an economic actor and acts in order to generate profit and income and use that to develop the country. Now, in state capitalism, there may or may not be economic planning, but more on that later. Now, state capitalism is more left-wing than the Nordic model of capitalism, but it's also worth noting that it's still practiced by a lot of Western countries, including the Nordic countries. For example, countries may monopolize oil production because they see that as beneficial of natural interests. So it's not as if the Nordic model of capitalism excludes state capitalism. It's basically just that state capitalism isn't a dominant part of that ideology. The role of the state as an economic actor it's not incorporated into the economic philosophy of that state. So whilst technically you could say that state capitalism is practiced by various Western countries and that therefore these various Western countries provide examples of state capitalism, really, when someone says state capitalism, you're thinking of something more economically left-wing, even if you're not technically wrong. So, I mean, also, economists like Noam Chomsky have practiced that even the USA practices state capitalism. For example, in how 2008 they used public money to bail out various large banks. But again, the essence of state capitalism is when the government has a dominant role in developing economy. So what are some things that a government may do in state capitalism? So for example, the state may directly invest in some industries or some companies. They might cooperate with companies directly or labor unions directly. They may subsidize companies to boost the competitiveness of that company or the wages. These are just various active forms of getting involved in the economy. There may also be various state-owned enterprises, often referred to as SOEs, which are run explicitly for the purpose of making profit. Now, state capitalism is associated with another model of capitalism, and it's more left-wing than the Anglo-Saxon model, the Rhenish model, and the Nordic model. It is the East Asian model of capitalism, which is named as such because it was pursued in East Asian countries like Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Now, in the East Asian model of capitalism, the government plays an active role in developing economy. They will make state-owned enterprises and back them with public money. They will create national champions, i.e. they will support large corporations with public money or state money and help them achieve global dominance. But in exchange, these corporations will be expected to contribute some way towards the national good. An example is, I believe, South Korea did this quite a lot with the formation of national champions. I'm just going to look up South Korea national champions. I can't spell, so this is going to be a little bit delayed. There we go. And it's just giving me football champions. Hold on, I'm going to pause this real quick. Okay, so an example of a South Korean national champion is the company of Hyundai, for example. But the point is that these national champions are private businesses, but due to the policy of the government, they're given this kind of dominant position in the national economy, and they're expected not just to seek profit, but to advance the interests of the nation in some way. And the government creates policies which favor these organizations. Now, the East Asian model of capitalism, again, I mentioned it's pursued in East Asia. China pursues a slightly more left-wing economic model than the East Asian model. More on that later. But some economists say that ever since China's enacted some reforms in the late 1970s, its model of capitalism can be described as East Asian capitalism. Now, in East Asia, the East Asian capitalism worked really, really well. And in fact, the term East Asian miracle is used to refer to the rapid development of these countries as a result. I'm just going to get some statistics up for you guys now. So, for example, in Japan throughout the 50s and 60s, average annual growth rates were around 10% and even reached 13% at some point. By contrast, in the UK, it would be in like the lower single digits, like solidly below 5. Also, in various East Asian countries, the size of the economy in like during the Golden Age of Capitalism doubled once every 10 years. Whereas in Britain, after it first industrialized in the 1700s, the size of the economy doubled after around 60 years. And in the USA, when it started industrializing, the size of the economy doubled in around 50 years. Just to find some more statistics, I mean, the GDP per capita of South Korea climbed from like $800 per head approximately in the early 60s to $22,000 per head a few decades later. Those are just rough statistics. There's a wealth of more statistics online, and I do really, really recommend looking it up. The role of the state in the East Asian model of capitalism is sometimes called a developmental state because the idea is that the state plays an active role in developing the economy. But just a very important thing to note, the idea of state capitalism and the idea of national champions isn't just associated with East Asian economies. It's also, at various points, been associated with Western economies. So, for example, after World War II, France followed an economic policy called dirigisme. That's dirigisme. And the idea is that the government hold on a second. National champions was a major part of the dirigisme policy of France from around 1945 to 1975. And the idea is that certain large corporations were given certain benefits in exchange for being seen as providing a service to the interests of the nation in general. And dirigisme in general is just a form of state capitalism wherein the government actually did something called indicative planning, but a bit more on that later. Another economic system which classically used state capitalism are the fascist economies of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. In Nazi Germany, I don't have much information on Italian economic statistics, although I know that fascist economics did play a role in developing the country. But in Nazi Germany, the shockingly, almost frightening development of the country from the aftermath of the Great Depression to 1939 is in no small part due to the policy of state capitalism advocated. So it was successful in these countries as well. It's worth noting that these countries which I've just mentioned, so the East Asian countries, China, Nazi Germany, France, use state capitalism with planning. Now, what actually is planning? Planning is a resource allocation mechanism. Now, the market is one resource allocation mechanism. So in a market resource allocation mechanism, i.e. in a market economy, the decisions on what gets made and how that gets distributed are based on the forces of supply and demand. In state planning, the idea is that the state, a planning body of the state, determines to some extent what gets produced and which organizations get which resources. Now, state planning is usually associated with economic systems of socialism, but it's compatible with certain forms of capitalism as well. Basically, when capitalism combines planning with a market economy, and when a market economy predominates in that economy, it's still a capitalist economy. And indeed, in the fascist economies, in France's dirigisme, in the East Asian model of capitalism, these are all models of capitalism. They're explicitly about maintaining private property and property rights and encouraging general private ownership of the means of production. But the idea is that this is supplementing with planning, where the state is used to encourage some development and growth in the economy to accomplish a national goal. That national goal could be greater national wealth or development, or it could be some form of another aim, such as the reduction of inequality. Now, planning can be indicative or imperative. Imperative, which is also known as directive planning, is more economically left-wing. Directive planning is probably the most left-wing form of capitalism that can be practiced. But again, more on that later, but it's associated with the People's Republic of China. Now, indicative planning is when you have multi-year plans are set to achieve certain investments or production targets, but the achievement of these targets aren't enforced. And the means to get companies to try and achieve these targets are by using inducements, so i.e. giving tax breaks or grants to encourage stuff. So an example of indicative planning is the government has a goal. They want to encourage renewable energy. So they give tax breaks to companies who invest in renewable energy. They'll also subsidize research in renewable energy, and they might set national targets for the percentage of energy gathered from renewable sources. That example, by the way, is part of a Green New Deal mixed economy state capitalism policy, by the way. Indicative planning also provides economic forecasts, which just gives some information to very different kinds of information of various different metrics in the economy and helps them make decisions. But the idea is that the state influences market forces to decide their course of action, but it doesn't actually determine which direction these market forces go. They don't control market forces. It's still capitalism because market forces are generally in control. The state just aids them. Now, fascist economics classically did this and kind of marketed this economic policy as this middle way between free market capitalism and socialism. But remember, fascism is violently opposed to socialism. Fascist leaders in practice throughout European history often cooperated with big businesses and large corporations, and their policies tended to benefit them to various extents. Fascism very much still supported in history private property and profit. It just subordinated these to the realization of state goals. And the East Asian model of capitalism and France's dirigisme policy is kind of included forms of indicative planning. By the way, just some information on France's dirigisme policy. Dirigisme was kind of enacted after World War II, and the 3 decades following the onset of the Golden Age and the onset of dirigisme are known as the Trente Glorieuses, i.e. meaning the 30 glorious years where France had a really high period of economic growth. Now, the most economically left-wing form of capitalism is a form called directive planning. Now, directive planning is a very big umbrella term. Basically, it just means the government plays some role in determining what companies actually do. Now, in indicative planning, the difference is in indicative planning, a plan is given, but there's no information given on how that plan should be implemented. The government doesn't say you have to do this or do this. It just says, this is the plan. In imperative planning, the implementation of that plan is commanded as well. That could be, for example, by government saying that certain targets they set on the economy, so for example, percentage of growth, is binding and that firms have to do them. And then in order to help firms achieve this, the state will either allocate raw materials or kind of manipulate prices in the market to help companies do this. Now, classically, this form of capitalism is associated with the practices of the People's Republic of China, the PRC. That needs to be distinguished from the Republic of China, the ROC, which is modern-day Taiwan. Taiwan followed the East Asian model of capitalism and rapidly developed during that time. An important phenomenon to note as well is that in the East Asian companies that follow the East Asian model of capitalism, after their period of economic development, they also quite rapidly democratized. The kind of link between economic prosperity and education and the formation of a middle class, the link between all those in democracy is something I'm going to explore further in a later episode, but it is definitely a real and important link. Now, the PRC identifies as socialists, but experts generally agree it's not actually a socialist economy. Now, the PRC calls its economy a socialist market economy. Based on the political science definition of socialism, the PRC is not a socialist economy. A socialist economy is when all the means of production are socially owned, i.e. not just owned by the state, but owned in some way by the people at large. So, if a state in a socialist country, any state which owns the means of production is doing so by proxy of the people and on behalf of the people. China is an authoritarian dictatorship, so this cannot be the case. But even without this definition, China still has lots of examples of the means of production being owned privately and operated at profit. The Chinese economy is just kind of a fusion between this form of directive planning and markets. Remember, many other forms of capitalism have a fusion of planets and markets as well, as I've just mentioned. It's the idea of state capitalism is a large umbrella term, and the People's Republic of China's conception of a socialist market economy, in quote marks, 'cause it's not socialist, can just be described as a very economic leftist form of state capitalism. All these terms I'm throwing around are umbrella terms. Now, in the socialist market economy, most firms in China are state-owned, or the state owns a controlling share in these enterprises. And these enterprises are run for income, which is used for things such as social expenditure. So, in the People's Republic of China, there's quite a high proportion of socially owned enterprises in the economy. In fact, I think it even may be predominant. I think 60% of enterprises may be socially owned or something. And I know I've been saying throughout this thing that, these various forms of regulated capitalism are still capitalism because there's a preponderance of private ownership of the means of production. But China is still capitalistic because there is still private ownership of the means of production. It may be apt to describe it as like a fusion between capitalism and nationalized ownerships of the means of production, but there is still a welcoming and an emphasis on the operation of market forces and allowing individuals to own the means of production privately and use it for profit. I don't want to emphasize the idea of as long as there's a preponderance of private ownership of means of production in various economies, it's still capitalism. I've just been saying that throughout this podcast to just kind of put everything in perspective. Like, for example, when I'm talking about the Nordic model, I'm emphasizing that it's still capitalism because there's still a preponderance of private ownership of the means of production, but it's not as if there isn't a plurality of private ownership of the means of production, it's no longer capitalism. Anyway, so also again in China, there are privately owned enterprises. They're recognized. Often the state intervenes with private enterprises in various forms, for example, giving them subsidies or favorable loans or preferential government treatment, but they are still privately owned. And of course, China has developed quite massively throughout the preceding economic decades. I want to find some statistics on that as well, because the GDP per capita of China, I remember even seeing that in Mao, during the time of Chairman Mao, so in the mid-1900s, it was in the double digits. Let me just check. Okay, I've just checked. So in 1960, under Mao, the GDP per capita in China was 90. 90. It is now around 13,000. Now, again, clearly the economic policies of China have been significant, and often there was the successor to Mao was a guy called Deng Xiaoping, who maintained the authoritarianism of the country, but also moved the country away from Mao's central planning and very, very economically left-wing economic system, and moved it towards capitalism, albeit a very heavily regulated form of capitalism with very large involvement of the state. But again, if you look up the causes of Chinese development, the undoubted main ones would be the economic policies that China has taken. But you'll also find lots of evidence saying that maybe the form of economics in which China is running their economy right now isn't optimum for their future growth, and that the economic development of China thus far is unsustainable for various reasons. The point I'm trying to make is that different economic systems work in different contexts. Based on the development of a state, the already existing level of development of a state, perhaps different economic policies are warranted to best facilitate further development of the state. And of course, also with the East Asian model of capitalism, although countries have developed massively in a span of a few decades, it's also because the starting point at which they had started their development was also quite low. But again, that doesn't discount the huge amount of development that's been going on. It's just that I want to just put the large growth rates in perspective, because developed, industrialized, advanced economies are always going to have slower growth rates than companies which are starting to industrialize and develop, because these most advanced countries are pushing the forefront of technology and economic growth. You may have also noticed that throughout this episode, I haven't really told you this economic form of capitalism is what works. This is what works. This doesn't work. I've used historical examples to name stuff which has worked better than others and to exclude a few policies that some people see as economically viable. But the thing is, economics is a really, really, really complex field. And in Polymath, what I try and do is take complex subjects and synthesize lots of different takes on these complex subjects to give a kind of overall, clear kind of view on these subjects and to answer a question in an accessible, satisfactory way. But obviously in this episode, I'm not capturing the full length of economic debate over the different forms of capitalism. And the truth is that if economists knew which form of capitalism was objectively the best, they'd all be doing it by now. The point I'm trying to make is that it's not as if economists are all just deliberately malign or wildly ignorant. Is that this is a very complex subject, and the lack of a real universal, unanimous consensus is testament to this subject's complexity. Now, this has been a spectacularly long episode. I'm really glad I re-recorded this, because this is way, way better than the recording of episode 11 I made before. As always, if you've listened to this point, I am deeply honored. Thank you very much for listening. I really hope you guys have enjoyed or found this interesting, and I hope you all have a lovely day. Take care.